on is a little strange for me because this is the chapter of the Bible that I have preached on more than any other. In the half dozen funerals or so that I've taken, this is the passage that I've preached from every time. And to be honest, rereading kind of the whole chapter this week with a different context in mind has been quite nice and refreshing. Speaking of funerals, the very first funeral that I ever took, I had a slightly interesting experience. It was moments before the service was going to start. My very first funeral, of course, so I'm a little bit nervous and trying to get myself in a pastoral kind of frame of mind, a sympathetic, empathetic kind of frame of mind before I conduct this memorial service. And I'm there chatting with the funeral director, and it kind of came up that this was my very first funeral. And all of a sudden, the funeral director was really excited and wanted to take me on a tour of all the stuff out the back of the funeral home. So she's kind of whisking me through the hallways and saying, this is where we pull the bodies through and we put them in the car here, and showing me all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. Like getting a crash course in the stark realities of corpse handling at a funeral home was kind of not what I needed 1 minute before I got up to take my first funeral. In hindsight, it was helpful information to have, but it was a bit of a jolt when I was trying to get myself in a different frame of mind. At most of the funerals I've spoken at, the people in the room, I have never met any of them before, except the family that I would have spoken to briefly in the week prior. And to those in that room, I start by asking one simple question in my address. What do you do when there's something you can't fix? When a problem before you is unfixable, where do you turn? Who's the person you go to for help? What do you do when you just can't undo a bad thing? Both Mary and Martha in the story we just heard are in that situation, aren't they? Their brother Lazarus dies, and they say to Jesus, both of them say this, right? If only you had been here. You could have fixed this. You could have done something about this. They desperately wish there was some way to fix this loss, to undo this tragic thing. And throughout our lives, as we at times are faced with the reality of death, we can be left wondering, can't we? Does God really care? Right now, in this moment as I grieve, does God care? And I don't just mean does God care about the brokenness of the world in general. I mean, does God care about me? Does he care about what I'm feeling right now? In John 11, we have a story, don't we, of a man who dies and his friends and family, and we find an answer to that question. The story is presented to us in 3 scenes. You can think of it a bit like a movie. 3 scenes. The first scene, death approaches and Christ waits. At the start of John 11, we get kind of the mundane details, don't we? There's this guy, Lazarus, and he's quite sick. Like he's really sick. And yeah, he's from the same place Martha and Mary are from. You remember Mary from earlier in the gospel? She's the one that anointed Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. Yeah, her brother, that Lazarus. Yeah, he's really sick. And really close friends with Jesus. Jesus' best mate is really, really sick. And if you've read John up to this point, you know what's going to happen next. You know what Jesus does in these situations. Jesus is going to go and heal this guy. In fact, Jesus himself seems to confirm it with what he says at the start, right? What's the first thing Jesus utters in this story? He says, this illness does not lead to death. It's going to lead to God's glory instead. In fact, Jesus said something very similar just a few stories back when he healed the blind man. He said, this is going to happen for the sake of God's glory. It's all pointing to the fact Jesus is about to heal Lazarus. Plus, we're told he really loves Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, aren't we? And so Jesus does what we expect. In verse 6, so because he loved them, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. That doesn't seem very loving, does it? Your best friend is in hospital, not just sick, but really sick. And so what do? Because you love them so much, you wait a few days for no apparent reason to go see them. And in fact, if we read just a bit on, we learn that Jesus missed his chance. Lazarus did die. If you can try for a moment to just imagine that you don't know what happens next in the story. If it's the first time you're reading this, John's Gospel, you get up to this point, you would be confused at this moment. In fact, I think we are deliberately kind of being stuck next to the disciples. It's like the storytelling is situating us with those disciples standing there, hearing Jesus say these things, watching him do these things, left feeling puzzled at what is going on. It's like we're one of those disciples seeing this unfold. And Jesus knowingly and confidently says this is designed to bring God glory, everything that's happening here. But the reason we're puzzled is, firstly, it seems like Jesus is flat out wrong at this point. He said it's not going to lead to death, and it does. And he seems also flat out unloving because he doesn't go to his friend and their family in their time of need. I mean, you can imagine, right, the press conference for Jesus' PR team. Yes, excuse me, Peter, from the Jerusalem Times, question for you. The leader of your party, Rabbi Jesus, on multiple occasions, his relationship with Lazarus of Bethany has been described as sincere and loving. And yet there are sources reporting today that your teacher knew Lazarus was deathly sick and chose to delay his travel to see him or help his family for multiple days. My question is just, how can you possibly justify this as the actions of a loving friend? Why did Jesus wait? I think there's at least two reasons. Firstly, one reason is a very practical reason. It's so that when he gets there and raises Lazarus from the dead, it's so that people cannot claim, maybe Lazarus wasn't quite dead, right? If Lazarus had been dead a day, maybe 2 days, then maybe it was a misdiagnosis. In fact, there was kind of a common belief, a spiritual belief, even amongst Jewish people, that kind of when a body was dying, the spirit kind of started to hover above the body and would try to get back in, which kind of explains sort of the slow dying of a person. If Jesus had raised Lazarus a day after he died, then maybe it was a trick. Maybe Lazarus wasn't really dead. But 4 days in a tomb, you're dead. But the main reason he waits, we're told, is because he loved them. How is this loving? Well, it allows his friends to go through some sorrow and mourning because Jesus wants them to witness a more amazing demonstration of his power over death. And so what happens next in the story? Jesus says to his disciples, hey guys, let's go to Judea. That's kind of the southern region where Bethany happens to be, just a few kilometers away from Jerusalem. And when he says that, the disciples say, sorry, did you say Judea? Because it sounded like you said Judea. Are you out of your mind, Jesus? You know that's the place we just left, and you know why we left was because they were trying to put you to death, right? Did you forget that little incident that happened? And Jesus, he gives a slightly cryptic response, a little sermonette about day and nighttime. And to sum up what I think it means, Jesus is saying his time is not up yet. The Father will keep him from harm, stop him from stumbling so long as it's day for him and there's work to do. And when the night comes, which I think is a metaphor for his death, it will come at the right time. And at that point, he also lets them know that Lazarus has died. Through supernatural divine knowledge, Jesus knows this. And so, a bit like a commander before a ragtag group of troops who are about to enter a dangerous battle they expect to die in, Thomas says, have courage, men. We will follow our leader even into death. That ends scene one. in all of the mundane details of the story, which show us it's real, these are real people at a real point in time, in amongst all that, Jesus just speaks with divine insight and shows incredible trust in the Father's timing. I could be wrong about this, but I imagine it was distressing for Jesus to wait. I imagined deep in his heart he wanted to go and heal Lazarus and be with his friends in that suffering, but he trusted God's timing. And that is a reminder to us, isn't it? That sometimes God will answer our requests for help in ways we do not expect, with timing we do not always like. Sometimes we will endure times of confusing waiting before we see the arrival of God's glory. That brings us to scene 2. Death strikes and family weeps. We are suddenly transported to Bethany, and John is sure to mention to us how long Lazarus has been in that tomb. And what is the scene we stumble into as the disciples head into Bethany, or towards Bethany at this point? There are many people there that have come to comfort Martha and Mary, as is right. These sisters are met by the comfort of others. Friends, there's no pretending in the Bible that the death of a brother or of a mother or of a friend is anything other than a shattering experience. When a life is stopped, our own lives stop in a way too. Mary and Martha's friends and family definitely care. But the question remains, does God care at this point? Well, Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, and Jesus sees the dead man's sister weeping, and he sees the friends who have come also weeping. And how does God in the flesh respond to those tears? Not with trite cliches. Oh, I know how you feel. Oh, he's in a better place. God needed him more than we did. Jesus' heart is so deeply moved by what he sees around him. He's so troubled by the tragedy and the wrongness of death that he says, "Take me to the body so I can weep with you." You know, verse 35, this is a fact you've probably heard before. It's famous for being the shortest verse in the Bible. Just 2 words in English. It's short, but it packs a punch, doesn't it? Wrapped up in those 2 words is a profoundly beautiful truth. The verse says simply, Jesus wept. And in that moment, God says, friends, I do know and I do care, and it's right for you to grieve, and I grieve along with you. The theologian Nicholas Walterstorff, he's the kind of philosophical academic who writes books that I do not understand. He wrote one book, though, that was very different. A personal memoir, a reflection. It was called Lament for a Son. And it's a collection of reflections that voiced his grief when his 25-year-old son, Eric, died in a mountain climbing accident. At one point, he writes this: "What do you say to someone who is suffering? Please don't say that it's not really so bad, because it is. Death is awful, demonic. If you think your task as comforter is to tell me that, oh, really, all things considered, it's not so bad, you do not sit with me in my grief, but you place yourself off in the distance away from me. Over there, you are of no help. What I need to hear from you is that you recognize how painful it is. I need to hear from you that you are with me in my desperation. To comfort me, you have to come close. Come sit beside me on my mourning bench. I know people do sometimes think some things are more awful than they really are. Such people need to be corrected gently, eventually. but no one thinks death is more awful than it is. It's those who think it's not so bad that need correcting. In this moment in the Gospels, Jesus misses his friend. Jesus misses his friend. And in this moment, God tears up because someone he loved fell victim to the terrible claws of sickness that attack our bodies and sometimes snatch from our hands the people we love most in the coldest and cruelest ways we can imagine. But Jesus doesn't just weep in this story. He is, we're told, intensely moved. One translation, which I think captures the meaning of the word here well, says, "A deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled." Jesus grieves the loss, but he is also angry at death itself. Friends, the Bible story says death is an intruder. It is wrong and it does not belong in God's world, and that angers Jesus. I once heard a preacher say that this next part of the story, Jesus is a bit like an Olympic weightlifter. You ever watch weightlifters in the Olympics? It's kind of this short moment where they actually lift the weight, but there's this kind of parade that goes on beforehand, right? This kind of psyching up that goes on, this walking with determination up to the podium like warriors filled with fiery purpose. Jesus is about to walk up to that tomb, blood pumping, ready to rip death apart with the thunder of his voice. Scene 3. Death undone and glory erupts. Still angered, still deeply moved, we're told, Jesus approaches. He says, "Move that stone, move it." I wonder, as I try to imagine this scene, if there were people there who kind of felt incredibly awkward at this moment, if they just thought, Jesus is not thinking straight. In the most intense kind of grief, sometimes people are irrational in their actions. And they can surely see that Jesus' emotions are running red hot here. Perhaps they tried to reason with him. Come on, Jesus, you know we can't do that. I know you want to see your friend, and I know you want to say your last goodbyes to him. But it's too late. Do we really have to spell it out to you? He's rotting. The smell would be so horrible. Martha says, as the language of the King James puts it so eloquently at this point, "Lord, by this time he stinketh." I love that. And at this point in the story, as we're reading, perhaps the puzzle pieces are starting to fall together. This sickness will not end in death. It's for God's glory, so God's Son may be glorified. Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going to go wake him up. It's so that you may believe your brother will rise again. Take away that stone. Really? When Jesus spoke to Martha back in scene 2, he didn't just bring comfort and sympathy. He didn't bring less than that, but he brought more than that. He also brought truth, the kind of truth only Jesus can bring. When Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again," what did Martha say? What did she think he meant? Martha said, "I know. Of course he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." You see, Martha believed what any Pharisee, any Orthodox Jew rightly believed at the time, that there would be an end times resurrection, that there would be a final resurrection. And then Jesus delivers the most important line in the whole story. In response to that, Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? If a decade ago somebody said, Steve Jobs is Apple, we would understand what they mean. We would get that metaphor. He is so connected to that company. He represents it so fully that it's right to say he is Apple. There's a moment in The Hobbit where Smaug the dragon, at one point, he's about to go burn Lake Town up. He says, I am death. He embodies that concept. When Jesus says, I am resurrection, he's saying something stronger than just he brings into the world resurrection. Eternal life and resurrection are so closely tied to him, embodied in him, that it is only through relationship with him that you find access to those things. This is what is so shocking about the story of the Messiah in the Gospels, right? God's people were expecting resurrection. That was part of their theology and their belief. But when Jesus comes, when the Messiah comes, resurrection suddenly jumps backwards in time. It enters in at the story early. It pierces the timeline and upends everyone's expectations about God's timing. You see, the signs Jesus performed in his ministry, they were the promises of the future being pulled back in time, radiating off of him, shooting off his presence like sparks on a Tesla coil, right? The resurrection and the life is here. Now, up to this point in the story, we have sat with the disciples, we have stood with the crowd looking on, not entirely sure what Jesus is planning to do, not entirely sure what he means by everything he's saying. And then he says to Martha, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And Jesus calls out, just like God called out in the beginning and spoke into existence the world. Just like God spoke and life was created, Jesus speaks and turns death into life. He undoes the bad thing we can't undo. And decomposing muscles are suddenly formed into healthy, strong, life-filled muscles, and breath returns to the lungs of that corpse. And this story, which has slowly built up to this point, very suddenly hits us with the dramatic moment and then ends. We get so much slow detail leading up to the moment, and then the resurrection happens. And then it's like very quickly we move on to something else. We don't see Lazarus come out and embrace Jesus. We aren't told they have a meal together. We don't hear Mary and Martha sing and dance with joy. We don't get any of those details. Instead, the camera that's been pointed at the tomb suddenly spins and points at us and the crowd. And we start to remember, Jesus said his glory would be displayed so his disciples would believe. He asked Martha, do you believe? Before he called Lazarus out of the tomb, he prayed to his Father, and he tells us why he prayed. He actually says, I know I didn't need to pray this out loud. I know you hear me, God. But I did this, why? For the benefit of all those standing here watching, that they would believe Jesus was sent from God. That question, do you believe, has been staring us in the face this whole time. And now the camera is pointed at the crowd, with us standing in the middle. And we read, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. To those with an attitude of humility, they see a proof here. They see an evidence that Jesus is to be taken seriously. And friends, millions of people reading this very story have been helped by the passage and the proof that it contains of who Jesus is. But it's possible to read the same story, to even stand there and see the same event and approach with an anti-Jesus stance and remain unconvinced because that's what you want to be. Those whose attitude is hostility see Jesus doing powerful things and they decide his power is dangerous and he and Lazarus have got to go. I'm sure Mary, Martha, Lazarus, Jesus, I'm sure they did embrace. I'm sure they did sing. I'm sure they did dance. I'm sure they did celebrate. But the story ends with us staring at the man who has come challenging the crowd's beliefs, claiming he's from God, which is either insane or evil or true. And he asks us, the story asks you, which do you think he is? In the end, Jesus really does love them, doesn't he? He really does love Martha and Mary and Lazarus, even though at the start it seems confusingly like he's acting against that. In fact, he loves them more than we realize. He loved them so much that he took himself and his disciples straight into danger. He has walked right up to the danger that is literally 2 to 3 kilometers away in Jerusalem. He is poised, he is in command in this story, and he is prepared to confront the threats on his life so that he can provide opportunities for people to believe in him. Does God care about your grief? Yes. In fact, he doesn't just care, he cares so much that he does something about the problem. He's the God with a fix to the thing we can't. He is a fixer, and he can even fix a problem like death. Jesus, he's like a parent walking up to a playground bully with fearsome authority and righteous anger, commanding, "Leave my kid alone." Jesus walks up to death and he says, "Leave my friend alone." And death whimpers and scampers out the door like a puppy. That's the man I want to trust my life to. Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this, Martha? Yes, Lord. I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. God in heaven, please help us to believe. Thank you that when Jesus walked this earth, the power of resurrection and life that he brought with him just radiated off him, gave proofs that he was sent from you. Help us when we grieve to know that you are the God who is bigger even than death. Help us when we console those in grief to not let the hope of resurrection cloud the fact that death is awful. Help us to mourn well with other people. God, help us to believe. Amen.
Amen. Please stand as we sing. just now, but in forever. Lord, we praise you for who you are, for your love, for your care, that you hear us. There is no greater love. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. I really pray that God has spoken to your heart today, and that you go out from here being more in love with Jesus and what he's done for you. A couple of reminders, 3 o'clock here for New Life if you'd like to come along. Go ahead, jump onto lifeac.org.au/marriage if you'd like to sign up or show that you're interested for the marriage course. $35 per couple, not individually, in case that wasn't clear. And if money is an issue, we would love for every married couple to do this course. So if money is an issue, come speak to me, come speak to Melissa. We can help you out. Enjoy time fellowshipping together.